It's funny how life works sometimes. One minute you're just a regular high school girl, and the next, you're the one everyone wants to talk to. The problem is, for me, it took a lot of pain to get here. My name is Chloe. I'm 24 years old, a fashion blogger and influencer living in New York City now, but it wasn't always this way. I grew up in a small town in Michigan where everyone knew everything about everyone. It was a close-knit community, or so I thought, until high school turned into a nightmare. I never thought I'd be the center of a rumor mill. I didn't do anything wrong. In fact, I kept my head down, did my work, and stayed out of trouble. But somehow, when Lilia, a girl I once called my best friend, decided I was her target, my life turned upside down. It all started with a simple lie. Lily told everyone that I had been secretly dating a popular guy in school, Jake Thompson. And when the rumor spread, it wasn't just a harmless whisper. No, it grew spiraling out of control until people started questioning everything about me. Why would Jake, the hottest guy in school, be interested in someone like me? Why hadn't anyone seen us together? The truth didn't matter. The rumor stuck. I remember the way it felt when I walked into the lunchroom that first day after the rumor spread. I swear the entire room fell silent. Whispers rippled through the tables. Eyes darted away when I looked their way. I tried to laugh it off, tried to pretend like it didn't bother me, but inside, I was shattered. My friends slowly stopped talking to me. Invitations to parties dried up. Even the teachers started treating me differently, as if I was somehow unworthy of their attention. Lily's betrayal felt like a punch to the gut. The worst part. The worst part was that I didn't even know why. What had I done to deserve this? To be humiliated by the one person I thought was my friend. By the time graduation rolled around, I was a shell of who I used to be. The pain of being ostracized was something I carried with me for years, even after I left Michigan. I buried it all deep, convinced that if I just focused on my future, I'd eventually forget. Then a few days ago, I received an invitation in the mail. You're invited to the 10-year high school reunion. I could hardly believe it. After everything, they wanted me back. My heart sank and then raced in my chest. I didn't want to go. Not to see Lily's smug face, not to relive those years of hurt and betrayal. But something inside me clicked. What if I went? What if I showed them all how far I'd come? As I stared at the invitation, I knew this reunion wasn't just about catching up with old friends. No, it was my chance for something bigger. I was going to make them regret ever turning their backs on me. Especially Lily. The days leading up to the reunion were a whirlwind. At first, I almost talked myself out of going. What was the point? To prove to people who didn't care about me that I'd made something of myself. But then I'd remember how the halls of my high school felt when I walked through them, the laughter, the whispers, the faces that pretended to be my friends. I wasn't just going to show up, I was going to make them remember me. I spent hours scrolling through my social media, reminding myself why I was where I was now. My blog had grown into a full-fledged business. I wasn't just some high school girl from a small town anymore. I was a successful entrepreneur. My designs had been featured in top fashion magazines, and I'd worked with major brands. I had my own clothing line. I was living in New York designing outfits that people actually wanted to wear. But there was still that feeling of inadequacy that never quite left, no matter how successful I was. I wasn't just going to the reunion for validation. I was going because I wanted revenge. I wanted Lily to know that everything she had ever said about me was wrong. I wanted her to regret the day she ever opened her mouth. The night before the reunion, I stood in front of my mirror adjusting the outfit I had designed myself. It was a bold choice, a deep red dress sleek with a cut that flattered my curves but not too revealing. It screamed confidence. I ran my hands down the fabric, feeling the satisfaction of something I had created with my own two hands. I wasn't just wearing a dress. I was wearing a statement. As I looked at my reflection, I thought about Lily. She had always been the one who everyone gravitated towards. Popular, smart, and with a perfect life on the outside. She'd never felt the sting of rejection that I had. But all that was about to change. I was going to show up at that reunion and make it clear to everyone that I had turned my life into something spectacular. And Lily, she was going to realize exactly what she'd cost me. The next day, I drove back to Michigan, my heart pounding as I approached the school. The familiar buildings were still standing, but everything else felt different. I wasn't the same person I had been in high school. I wasn't the girl who sat alone at lunch, the one who was ignored. No, I was Chloe, now the woman who had made it. I parked in the lot and walked to the entrance of the reunion hall. My heels clicked on the pavement, each step louder than the last. When I entered, the chatter from old classmates stopped. Everyone turned to look. For a moment, I felt that same rush of anxiety I had all those years ago, but this time it was different. This time I was in control. And then I saw her. Lily was standing across the room, surrounded by a group of people who were hanging on to her every word. She looked the same, blonde hair, perfect smile, her posture that exuded confidence. But there was something different about her, too. She wasn't the girl who had a hold on me anymore. No, now I had the power. I smiled a slow, calculated smile before making my way toward the bar. As I passed by Lily, I made sure to catch her eye. Her gaze flickered for a second, but she didn't say anything. No. Hey, Chloe, it's been so long. No acknowledgement. But I wasn't expecting that. I wasn't here to be nice. I was here to make her feel what I had felt. Invisible. I sipped my drink, watching the room, watching her. The buzz of conversation slowly picked up again, but my eyes stayed locked on Lily. She was talking to some of the same people who had turned their backs on me years ago. As she laughed and joked, I could feel the tension rising inside me. The anger. The need for justice. It was all building. And then it happened. I spotted the old yearbook in the corner, and that was the moment I knew how I was going to do this. I wasn't just going to confront Lily and tell her how much she'd hurt me. No, I was going to expose her. I was going to make sure she never, ever forgot what she did. The yearbook. The perfect tool for my plan. It was a physical representation of everything that had happened to me in high school. Every photo, every caption was a reminder of the lies, the betrayal, and the cruel whispers, but it also held the key to my revenge. I had seen the yearbook in the corner of the room when I first walked in, forgotten by some old classmate who didn't even realize its significance. It was open to the page of senior superlatives, the most likely to succeed best couple class clown. As I passed it again, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Lily's picture right there under most likely to succeed. I could almost hear her laugh in my head. She was the one who had the perfect life. Everyone adored her. Everyone wanted to be like her. But now, standing in front of that yearbook, I knew something she didn't. I had all the power. I walked over to the table where the yearbook was and slowly turned the pages. The sharp sound of the paper turning cut through the murmur of voices around me. I could feel the eyes on me, but I didn't care. I was beyond caring about what people thought. What I cared about was making Lily squirm. I stopped at the page where Lily's picture was. Her perfect smile stared back at me. But instead of feeling resentment, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. This was the moment. I was going to expose her for what she really was. The plan started to form in my mind. It wasn't enough to just confront her. It wasn't enough to call her out in front of everyone. No, I needed to show them all the real Lily, the manipulative, cruel person who had driven me into hiding for years. I had a way to make that happen. I knew I had to act fast. People were starting to mingle again, and the longer I waited, the more it felt like the moment might slip away. I walked straight to the DJ booth and asked for the microphone. The room went silent as the music died down, all eyes on me. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't afraid. I was in control. Hey everyone, I just wanted to take a moment to say something. I started, my voice clear and strong. I could feel Lily's eyes on me, sharp and judgmental, but I didn't let it affect me. High school was a time when we all learned a lot about who we are and who we trust. And I guess for me, it was a lesson I learned the hard way. I paused for effect, watching the faces of the people who had once turned their backs on me, waiting for the tension to build. I don't know if you all remember the rumor that went around about me and Jake Thompson, I said, letting the words sink in. The room went still. I could see the realization on some faces, the way they recalled those days of whispers and judgment. Well, I continued, you can thank Lily for that. She's the one who started it. She's the one who decided to tell everyone I was secretly dating Jake, even though it wasn't true. And I'm sure some of you remember how that felt for me, being ostracized, laughed at, ignored by people who were supposed to be my friends. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear the low murmurs from the crowd, the surprise in their voices. Some people had already started to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Lily, I said, my eyes locking with hers. You took everything from me. My dignity, my trust, and my happiness. You used me to make yourself feel better and for what to be, most likely to succeed. I could see Lily's face redden. Her perfect put-together facade started to crack. She opened her mouth to speak, but I wasn't finished. But I'm not here to just rehash old wounds, I said, turning back to the crowd. I'm here to tell you all that, despite everything she did, I turned it into something better. I'm not the shy, quiet girl you all remember. I built a life for myself. I made something out of the pain you all put me through. I could see some people nodding, others whispering. The tables were turning. Lily had no idea what to do. She looked around the room, but the damage was already done. I just wanted to say, I added, that I'm not the girl you tried to break. I'm stronger than that. And if any of you are still wondering why I came here today, it's because I've forgiven Lily. For all of it. Because I wouldn't be who I am today without it. I took a deep breath, letting the words sink in, and then handed the microphone back to the DJ. The room was still in shock. Lily stood there frozen. She didn't know how to react. For a moment I thought she might break down. But instead she straightened her back and walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. I stood there for a moment watching her leave. But I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. No, what I felt was something better. I felt free. The silence in the room was deafening after I handed the microphone back to the DJ. For a few seconds no one moved. They just stared at me, processing what had just happened. It was like time had frozen and everyone was waiting for someone to make the first move. I didn't feel any rush to leave, though. I'd said what I needed to say. Now it was Lily's turn to face the consequences. I could hear the murmurs starting to pick up. People were talking, exchanging looks. Some of them glanced over at me, unsure whether to approach or avoid me. But what struck me the most was the shift in the room's energy. The feeling that I wasn't the girl who had been humiliated all those years ago. No, I was the one with control now. I saw Lily again, standing by the exit, her back straight but her face pale. She was trying to regain her composure, but it was clear she was rattled. She was always the one in control, the one everyone admired. But today, she was the one who had been exposed, the one who had been forced to face the truth. I watched her leave the room. Her heels clicked loudly on the floor as she stormed out of the reunion hall. Some people started to follow her, probably to check on her, but I didn't care. I wasn't here for her anymore. I was here for me. As the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. It wasn't just about Lily anymore. It was about me, finally taking back my life. I walked around the room, reconnecting with old classmates who had once turned their backs on me. Some of them came up to apologize, others just gave me knowing glances. But there were no more whispers behind my back. No more judgments. I could see the respect in their eyes. And that, in the end, was what I'd wanted. But as the night came to a close, I found myself alone in a corner, deep in thought. There was a sense of satisfaction, but it wasn't complete. A part of me had expected to feel vindicated, to feel the weight of the years of pain and betrayal lifted in an instant. But instead I felt an unexpected emptiness. I had taken my revenge. I had made everyone in that room see the truth about Lily, but in the process I had uncovered something about myself. I had been holding on to the pain for so long, thinking that if I exposed her, it would heal me. But it didn't. It didn't change what had happened. It didn't erase the years I spent feeling worthless, feeling like I wasn't good enough. I wasn't sure what I expected from this night. Maybe I thought I would get some sort of closure. But as I looked around, seeing people enjoying the rest of the reunion, I realized that the closure I was looking for wasn't going to come from anyone else. It had to come from me. And in that moment, I understood. Revenge had given me power, but forgiveness was going to give me peace. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about proving to myself that I was enough. The reunion ended, and I left with a sense of calm I hadn't expected. The night had been everything I needed it to be and more. I drove home in silence, the night sky stretching out above me. As the city lights blurred in the rearview mirror, I smiled softly. For the first time in years, I felt free. The days following the reunion were a blur. The moment I walked out of that hall, I felt as though a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I didn't expect the feeling to stay, but it did. For the first time in years, I felt free. I kept replaying the events of the night in my head. There were moments when I thought I'd be overwhelmed with satisfaction, when I'd feel that rush of victory. But instead, there was peace. It was a quiet, calm feeling that came with knowing I had done something for myself. I had reclaimed my story. The next morning, I sat down at my desk with a cup of coffee, my phone buzzing with notifications. Messages from friends, comments on my social media, and even a few emails from potential clients. It was all a reminder that I had come so far, that the girl who had been crushed by rumors and rejection was now the woman who was building an empire. But there was one message that stood out. It was from an old classmate, someone I barely remembered. Chloe, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened in high school. I was one of those who believed the rumors about you. I was wrong, and I should have known better. That message hit me harder than I thought it would. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about Lily. It wasn't just about the people who had turned their backs on me. It was about how I saw myself. All these years, I had carried the weight of their opinions, their judgments, their doubts. But I didn't need to anymore. For the first time in a long while, I took a deep breath and smiled. Not because of the revenge I had taken, but because I had let go of the past. I had finally let it go. And as the days went by, I noticed something else. The business I had built continued to thrive. My followers grew. Opportunities poured in. But more than that, I felt something else. Something that had been missing from my life for so long. I felt proud. Proud of the woman I had become, proud of how far I had come, and proud of the fact that I had learned the most important lesson of all. The greatest revenge isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving to yourself that you are enough, that you are worthy of everything you've worked for. And I had finally proven that to myself. I had my peace, and nothing could take that from me. As the weeks passed, life settled into a new rhythm. I focused on growing my business, connecting with brands, and designing my next collection. I felt more at peace with myself than I had in years. But there was something else that had changed, something I hadn't fully realized until now. I wasn't just building a business anymore. I was building a legacy. I took a moment to reflect on everything that had led me to this point. The pain, the betrayal, the humiliation. It had all shaped me, molded me into the person I had become. And for the first time, I felt gratitude for that journey. I wasn't angry anymore. I didn't feel the need to hold on to the past. I had learned to let go. But I knew deep down that the reunion wasn't just a chapter in my life. It was the final chapter in the story of my past. The girl who had been hurt by lies and abandonment no longer existed. She had been replaced by the woman who had risen from the ashes, stronger, wiser, and unshakable. As I sat in my apartment one evening, sipping a glass of wine and scrolling through the latest photos of my new collection, I felt a sense of accomplishment wash over me. My phone buzzed and I looked down to see a new message. It was from Lily. Chloe, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I regret everything I did to you. I was wrong, and I've spent so many years living with that guilt. I don't expect us to be friends, but I hope you can find peace, knowing I've changed. I'll always be sorry. For a moment, I just stared at the message. I had expected anger, maybe even denial, but this was different. Lily wasn't the same person she used to be either. She had faced her own reckoning just like I had. And maybe we had both learned the most valuable lesson of all. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing someone's actions. It was about letting go of the weight they placed on you. And in that moment, I realized I had forgiven her. Not for her, but for me. It wasn't about reconciliation or becoming friends again. It was about freeing myself from the past once and for all. I took a deep breath, typed a response, and hit send. Thank you, Lily. I appreciate your message. I've forgiven you. As I set my phone down, a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying lifted off my shoulders. I had taken back control of my life, and now I was free. Free from the pain. Free from the resentment. Free from everything that had held me back for so long. I smiled to myself as I stared out the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and for the first time in my life, I truly felt like I had everything I needed. The journey had been long and painful, but it had brought me to a place of peace, strength, and self-love. I was proud of the woman I had become, and as for Lily, well, she would never have the power to hurt me again. Months had passed since the reunion, but it felt like a lifetime. Life had moved on, and so had I. The scars of the past, though never fully erased, had faded into something more manageable. I no longer saw myself as the girl who had been defined by other people's lies or the whispers in the hallways. Instead, I had become someone stronger, someone who had carved her own path. I was no longer Chloe from Michigan. I was Chloe, the entrepreneur, the designer, the woman who had built her own empire. And more than that, I had become someone who was finally at peace with who she was. But there was still one thing left undone. One final piece of the puzzle that I had to face. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about moving forward and finally confronting the last person who had ever truly hurt me. Jake Thompson. I hadn't thought about him in years, but after the reunion, his name kept resurfacing in my mind. We had never been in a relationship, not really. But the rumors, the ones Lily had started, had revolved around him. Jake was the centerpiece of it all. And even though he had been just as much a victim of Lily's manipulations as I had been, something about the way he had stayed silent all those years still bothered me. Jake had been the golden boy in high school, the one everyone admired and wanted to be close to. He had been the one to clear up the rumors after they spread, but he hadn't done it for me. He'd done it for himself. He'd done it to protect his reputation. For years, I had wondered if I'd ever get an apology, even a small one, from him. Maybe it was naive to expect that, but a part of me still held on to that hope. The truth was, I didn't want to carry any more anger. I wanted to move on, and that meant facing everything, every person, every event that had shaped me. So I decided to track Jake down. It wasn't easy. After all, he had moved on with his life, just like I had. He had built his career, married someone else, and had children. But after some searching and a few mutual connections, I finally found him. He was living in Chicago now, working for a tech company. I couldn't help but feel the irony. The same guy who had been at the center of my high school misery had now become someone completely different in my life. I picked up my phone and stared at his number for a moment. I felt a mix of hesitation and determination. This wasn't about closure. This wasn't about getting him to admit any guilt or wrongdoing. This was about me taking control of my narrative once and for all. I dialed the number. The phone rang twice before he picked up. His voice, familiar but distant, answered, "Hello, Jake." I said, my voice steady but a little unsure. "It's Chloe." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Chloe, wow, long time. How have you been?" I could hear the warmth in his tone, the polite curiosity. But I wasn't here for small talk. "I'm good, actually. Better than I've ever been." I paused, collecting my thoughts. "I just wanted to talk about something. The rumors from high school. About you and me." Another pause. Then he spoke, his voice softening. "Look, Chloe, I never meant for any of that to happen. You know that, right? I never wanted to hurt you. I should have done more back then. I should have stepped in. I should have said something." I felt my chest tighten. Hearing him admit that after all these years felt like a weight being lifted. It wasn't an apology I had been waiting for. It was something even more valuable. A recognition of what happened, not for me, but for the truth. "I know," I replied. "I know, Jake. But it's okay. I've moved on. And I needed to hear you say that. I needed you to acknowledge it. I'm not angry anymore. I'm free." There was a long pause, and I could hear him breathing softly on the other end. "You're right. I should have done better. And I'm glad to hear that you've moved on." "I have," I said, smiling to myself. "And I just wanted to thank you for being honest even now." After a few more minutes of conversation, we hung up. It wasn't a grand, life-changing conversation. It wasn't the kind of thing you see in the movies where everything is tied up in a neat little bow. But it was enough. For the first time in my life, I could feel the anger I had been holding onto for so long dissolve completely. That night, I sat on my couch looking out the window at the city skyline. The lights twinkling in the distance felt like stars in the night sky. I realized then that the only person I had ever needed to forgive was myself. I had carried the weight of those high school years for too long, blaming others, blaming circumstances. But now I understood. I was the one who had the power to release it. With every step I had taken, every decision I had made, I had reclaimed my life. The journey had been painful, but it had made me who I was. And that woman, she was unstoppable. A year had passed since the reunion, and life had settled into a rhythm that felt intentional, grounded. My fashion line had grown, my followers had grown, and opportunities were still coming my way. But more than the success, there was a new kind of freedom I hadn't felt before. A freedom from the past, from the grudges, from the stories that once defined me. Chloe from Michigan, the scared, betrayed girl, was gone. In her place stood Chloe, the woman confident, creative, and unapologetically herself. And for the first time, I didn't need anyone else to validate that. One morning, as I sipped coffee at my apartment in New York, I thought back to Lily, to Jake, to the whispers that once shaped my life. It wasn't revenge, not anymore. Revenge had been a lesson, a catalyst that pushed me forward. What mattered now was the life I was building, the legacy I was leaving for myself, not for anyone else. I thought about reaching out to some of my old classmates, the ones who had been kind after I took my stand at the reunion, but I realized I didn't need to. My life wasn't about reliving the past or seeking approval anymore. My life was about growth, creativity, and freedom. And so I poured myself into my work, designing the new collection I'd always dreamed of. Each stitch, each fabric choice, each detail was infused with my own story, a story of struggle, betrayal, strength, and ultimately, self-love. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about proving to myself that I could rise from the ashes of my past stronger than ever. Sometimes late at night, I still think about Michigan. I think about Lily and the girl I once was. But instead of anger or sadness, I feel gratitude. Gratitude for the pain that taught me resilience. Gratitude for the betrayal that sparked determination. Gratitude for the silence that pushed me to find my own voice. I had learned the ultimate lesson that the greatest revenge is not to hurt someone else, but to live well, to thrive, and to love yourself fiercely. And in doing so, I had reclaimed not just my story, but my peace, my strength, and my happiness. As I looked out the window at the city lights twinkling below, I smiled. Life had come full circle, and for the first time, I truly felt that I was exactly where I was meant to be. 2 years had passed since the reunion, and life had come full circle for me. My fashion line, once a dream, was now a household name in the industry. What started as a small blog had transformed into a thriving business, and I had grown into a figure people looked up to. But beyond the accolades and success, there was one thing that mattered more than anything. I was at peace. As I sat in my studio one late afternoon sketching ideas for a new collection, I thought back on everything that had brought me to this point. The struggles, the pain, the betrayals, they had all played a part in shaping the woman I had become. And though I had forgiven those who had wronged me, there was still a small piece of my heart that carried the lessons from those years. It wasn't bitterness or anger. It was strength. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of my thoughts. A new message from an old friend. It was Emily, one of the few people who had truly stuck by me through the tough times. She had become more than a friend. She had become a sister. "Hey Chloe, I know it's been a while, but I wanted to check in. The anniversary of the reunion is coming up. How are you feeling about it?" I smiled as I read her message. The anniversary of the reunion. The day I had taken back control of my life. It seemed like so long ago now, and yet it felt like the moment that had truly defined me. "Wow, I can't believe it's been 2 years," I typed back. "I'm in a good place. Honestly, I've never been happier." That night changed everything for me. And I've learned that the greatest power I have is in how I choose to move forward. A few minutes later, Emily's reply came. "That's amazing, Chloe. You've come so far. I'm so proud of you." As I put my phone down, I realized just how far I had come, not just in my career, but in my journey of self-love and acceptance. I had no more room in my life for resentment. I had built a legacy not of revenge, but of resilience, creativity, and the belief that no matter what happens, we have the power to redefine our story. I stood up and walked over to the window of my studio. The skyline of New York stretched before me, and for the first time in years, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything, every step, every decision, every hardship that had led me here. As I watched the sun set over the city, I realized that the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. I was no longer the girl who had been betrayed. I was no longer the woman who needed approval. I was the architect of my own life, and my story was one I was proud to tell. The future was wide open. The first few months of this year had felt like a whirlwind of opportunity. I had just wrapped up my latest fashion collection, and the response was beyond anything I could have imagined. My designs were now being showcased at international fashion weeks, and for the first time I was starting to consider what it would mean to take my brand global. But with success came new challenges, and they weren't just about business. They were about something far deeper: my place in this world, my roots. I was standing in my apartment looking out over the city skyline of New York. The city had become my home. But as I stared at the familiar scene, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The world was vast, full of possibilities, and I was starting to realize that my vision had always been limited. That's when I got an unexpected call. It was Emily. "Chloe, you won't believe this, but I just heard from one of your old friends from Michigan. They're asking if you'd be interested in working with a charity over in Europe, fashion for social good. It's a huge opportunity, and it might be just the new challenge you've been looking for." I felt a flutter of excitement and curiosity. Europe, social good. It sounded like the perfect next step. "I'm listening," I said, trying to hide the excitement in my voice. Emily went on to tell me that the charity based in Milan was partnering with designers to create clothing for disadvantaged communities. The idea was to take high-end fashion and make it accessible to those who needed it most. The project had already garnered a lot of attention and they wanted me to be a part of it. I paused, the weight of it sinking in. This wasn't just about creating another collection. This was about making a difference. About using my platform, my creativity, to bring something greater to the world. Within a few weeks, I had packed my bags and was on a plane to Milan. The transition from New York to Europe felt surreal, but also exhilarating. The minute I set foot in Milan, I knew I was in the right place. The city, with its beautiful blend of history and modernism, spoke to me in ways I didn't expect. I arrived at the charity's headquarters, a stunning building nestled in the heart of Milan's fashion district. Inside, the atmosphere was a mix of excitement and purpose. Designers, marketers, and social entrepreneurs buzzed around brainstorming ideas. I was introduced to the team, an eclectic, passionate group of people who all had one thing in common: a drive to change the world. They explained the project to me. It wasn't just about creating fashion, it was about creating a movement. Fashion was going to be the vehicle for social change, helping to empower underrepresented communities through education, work opportunities, and giving them a voice. It was about sustainability, about ethical sourcing, and about using style as a platform to make a statement. As I sat in the meeting listening to everyone's ideas and vision, something clicked inside me. I had spent years working in the fashion industry building my own brand, but there was something different about this project. This was bigger. This was not just about making money or creating something pretty, it was about making an impact. I immediately jumped into the project, designing a limited edition collection that would highlight the artisans from disadvantaged backgrounds. The designs would be created using sustainable, ethically sourced fabrics, and each piece would tell a story, stories of resilience, hope, and change. In the weeks that followed, I collaborated with local artisans, traveled to small villages to meet the people whose hands would bring these designs to life, and got to know the deeper purpose behind the project. I saw how fashion could be more than just about trends. It could be a bridge between cultures, between struggles, and between people. One day, I met with one of the artisans who would be helping bring my designs to life. Her name was Sophia, a woman in her 40s who had spent most of her life working in a textile factory. She had always dreamed of using her skills to create something beautiful, but her circumstances had never allowed her to. We sat down to talk, and as she shared her story with me, I realized how much more I was learning from her than I could have imagined. Sophia, like many of the artisans, had faced challenges that I couldn't even begin to fathom. Yet through all of that, she still had a passion for what she did. She wasn't just sewing fabric, she was stitching together a future for herself and her family. This experience, this project, was unlike anything I had done before. It wasn't just about designing clothes, it was about designing futures. I could feel the ripple effect of what we were doing, and it fueled me more than any runway show ever could. The fashion world had always been fast-paced, glamorous, and competitive, but now I was learning that it could also be compassionate, intentional, and deeply meaningful. I had built my career on passion, but now I was learning what it meant to build something that would leave a legacy. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if I was enough or if this was even possible. But then I thought back to everything I had been through: the pain, the betrayal, the transformation, and I knew that this was my next step. This was my purpose. By the time the collection was ready to be unveiled, I stood backstage at the Milan Fashion Week watching as the models walked down the runway, wearing pieces that had been crafted by hands that had once been overlooked. The crowd was silent as they watched each piece, the stories behind each design resonating in the room. And in that moment, I knew that this wasn't just fashion, it was a revolution. The applause at the end of the show was deafening. I stood there smiling, knowing that this was only the beginning. My career had evolved into something more than I ever imagined, and it felt right. For the first time, I wasn't just building a brand, I was building a movement. And as the lights dimmed and the crowd filtered out, I realized something else. It wasn't the revenge, the pain, or even the success that had driven me. It was the power of transformation, of taking what had once broken me and turning it into something beautiful. The future was more than just open now, it was wide, endless, and full of possibilities. It had been several months since I moved to Milan to work with the charity, and the impact of our work had begun to ripple through the fashion industry. The collection I designed had garnered attention not just for its unique designs, but for its message: fashion as a force for change. People were starting to see fashion in a new light, not just as a product to consume, but as a vehicle for storytelling, for empowerment, and for social transformation. I stood in the heart of Milan's fashion district one bright morning, watching as the city bustled with life. The streets were full of tourists and locals alike, each person moving with purpose, much like the world of fashion that was constantly in motion. But what struck me that morning wasn't the busy streets or the fashionable crowds, it was the change I was seeing in myself. I wasn't the same person who had walked into this city months ago. The woman I had become was stronger, more grounded, and more certain of her purpose than ever before. The collaboration with the charity had taught me so much. It wasn't just about creating clothes, it was about telling a story, about bringing communities together, and about making a lasting impact. But there was still more work to be done. Over the past few months, I had visited various small communities across Europe, meeting with artisans, designers, and young people who had been empowered by our work. There was one community that stood out to me the most, a small town in southern Italy. The women there had formed a cooperative, and they used the skills they had learned to create beautiful handcrafted textiles. It wasn't just a craft for them, it was a lifeline. The day I visited them, I watched as they worked with passion, their hands moving with precision, creating beautiful, intricate patterns that would soon be part of our next collection. These women, who had once been overlooked by society, were now shaping the future of fashion. It was humbling to see how something as simple as a piece of fabric could change lives. The day I spent with them became a turning point for me. It wasn't just about using fashion to tell stories, it was about creating a movement that would empower not just the communities I worked with, but the entire world. I knew that this was only the beginning. I was no longer just a designer, I was a part of something much larger than myself. But with every new project came new challenges. The fashion world was still competitive, and the pressure to stay relevant was always there. I often found myself battling doubt, wondering if I was doing enough, if the impact was truly lasting. One afternoon, I found myself sitting at my desk surrounded by design sketches, wondering if the impact I was making was enough. Was I really changing the world, or was it all just a small drop in an ocean that would never notice? It was in those quiet moments of self-reflection that I realized something important: change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't always come with a loud bang. Sometimes it's the quiet ripple that makes the biggest difference. I was sitting in my studio when I received a message that would change everything. It was from Emily, my constant support through all of this. Her message was simple, but it struck me to the core. "Chloe, I just got a letter from one of the women you worked with in that small town. She wrote that she's now started her own fashion line and her community is flourishing because of the skills you helped them develop." I sat back in my chair, the weight of the message sinking in. This wasn't just about creating fashion collections or showcasing them at Milan Fashion Week. This was about creating a legacy, one that went far beyond anything I had imagined. It was about empowering others to take control of their own futures. It was about showing people that they could break free from the cycles that held them down. It was about giving people the tools to make a difference, not just in fashion, but in their own lives. I realized then that the ripple effect had already begun. I was only one person, but the change I had sparked was spreading just like the waves that follow a stone thrown into water. And I had only scratched the surface of what was possible. That night, I sat by the window of my Milan apartment, staring out at the city. I thought about the women in southern Italy, the artisans I had worked with, the young designers, and the community that was now thriving because of our work together. I thought about the future, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't scared of what was ahead. I wasn't worried about being enough or whether I was making a difference. I knew deep down that I was. And the best part? I was just getting started. It had been nearly a year since I first arrived in Milan, and in that time, everything had shifted. The charity project I'd joined had not only changed the lives of those I worked with, but it had changed mine as well. It wasn't just about designing clothes anymore. It was about igniting a movement that connected people across borders, across cultures, and most importantly, across struggles. The Fashion for Social Good initiative had taken off in a way I hadn't expected. Our collection had reached countries I had never imagined, and the concept of using fashion as a platform for social change had gained momentum. What began as a small collaboration was now a global effort with designers, artisans, and activists, all coming together to make a difference. I sat in my Milan studio one quiet morning looking at a map on the wall of all the countries that had been impacted by our work. Europe had been just the beginning. We had expanded into Asia, Africa, and even South America. In each region, the impact was palpable. Artisan communities were thriving, young designers were getting the opportunity to showcase their work, and most importantly, we had created a platform that empowered people. But with success came new challenges. Running a global initiative was no small feat. The logistics alone were overwhelming, and there were days when I found myself struggling to keep up with the constant demand. I had learned to delegate to trust my team, but there were moments when the weight of it all felt too heavy. One morning, I received a call that would set everything in motion again. It was from one of the lead organizers in Africa, where we had recently launched a partnership. The initiative there had exploded, and the demand for our work was greater than ever. They wanted to know if I could personally come to oversee the expansion. At first, I hesitated. There was so much going on in Milan, so many moving parts that needed my attention. But deep down, I knew that this was part of the journey. I had always believed in leading by example, and if this movement was going to continue growing, I had to be on the ground, in the trenches, doing the work. I packed my bags once again, this time heading to Nairobi, Kenya. The flight was long, but my mind was racing with possibilities. This wasn't just a business trip. This was a chance to see firsthand the difference we were making in people's lives. It was a chance to witness the global ripple effect of the work we had started. When I landed in Nairobi, I was greeted by a team of passionate people who were ready to take on the world. The energy in the city was contagious, and as I toured the artisan centers and spoke with the locals, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. I was seeing in real time how our initiative had transformed lives. The artisans in Nairobi, many of whom were women, had found not just employment, but purpose. Their work was no longer something done in the shadows. It was now being celebrated. Their designs were showcased at global events, their stories told on international stages. They were no longer invisible. They were seen, heard, and valued. I spent the next few weeks working alongside the local teams, helping to refine our processes and expand our impact. But the experience left me with something more than just professional growth. It gave me a renewed sense of clarity. I had come full circle. The journey that began with my personal healing through pain and betrayal had led me here to a global movement that was changing the world one piece of fabric at a time. On my final day in Nairobi, I sat with some of the artisans in a small circle sharing stories and laughs over tea. One of the women, a designer named Amina, turned to me and said, "You gave us more than just a platform. You gave us our dignity back. You showed us that our work matters." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I had come here to give, to teach, to help. But in that moment, I realized that I had gained more than I could ever repay. The power of these communities, the resilience they showed, the hope they carried, it was all a reflection of the work we had done together. As I flew back to Milan, the weight I had once felt seemed to lift. The pressure, the constant demand, it was still there, but now it felt different. It felt like a responsibility I had embraced, not a burden I had to carry alone. This was bigger than me. Bigger than Milan, bigger than New York, bigger than fashion itself. My designs were now being sold in multiple countries, from the bustling streets of Tokyo to the vibrant markets of Cape Town. Each piece was more than just an article of clothing. It was a symbol of resilience, of empowerment. Everywhere I went, I saw the impact. In local markets, in villages, and even in major fashion capitals, people were coming together to support the cause. The pressure to stay relevant, the pressure to innovate, the pressure to continue this movement without faltering. It was a lot to carry, and at times it felt overwhelming. There were days when I questioned myself, when I wondered if I was really making a difference or if I had become just another cog in the machine of global commerce. One evening, after a particularly grueling week of back-to-back meetings and design deadlines, I found myself walking through the quiet streets of Milan seeking solitude. The cool night air washed over me, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of stillness. It was as if the city had slowed down just for me. As I walked, I thought about the early days of my career, the days when I first started my blog, when all I had was a dream and a passion for fashion. Back then, I didn't have the weight of the world on my shoulders. I had no global movement to manage. I had no pressure to live up to. I had nothing but the desire to create. It was then that I realized I had lost something along the way. Somewhere in the hustle of building a brand, in the whirlwind of expansion, and in the constant drive to do more, I had lost sight of the very thing that had started it all: my love for creating. I remembered how excited I was back in the early days when I designed a piece, and it was just for me. No expectations, no pressure. It was just me and the fabric creating something from my soul. Somewhere along the way, I had become too focused on the outcome, on the results, on the business side of things. I had forgotten the pure joy of creation. I decided then and there that I would make a change. I didn't know what it would look like, or how I would get there, but I knew I had to reconnect with the heart of my work. The next day, I took a break from meetings. I locked myself in my studio, away from the emails and phone calls, and just started creating. No deadlines, no expectations, just the process. I designed pieces that didn't have to be anything but beautiful. I let myself experiment again, to get lost in the art of creation. As I worked, I felt that old spark return. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. It wasn't about being the best. It was about rediscovering the reason I started this journey in the first place: to create, to inspire, to be authentic. By the time I had finished my new collection, I realized something profound. This wasn't just a collection of clothes, it was a reflection of my growth. I had learned so much over the years about business, about leadership, about empowering others. But now I was learning something even more important: to create for the sake of creating, to allow myself to simply be. The collection was a success, but more importantly, it was the most personal and fulfilling work I had done in a long time. People loved the pieces not just because of the design, but because of the soul that went into them. That night, as I sat in my studio looking at the new pieces, I realized that true success wasn't about building a global empire or changing the world on my own. It was about finding peace in the process, in the journey. It was about creating with purpose, without the weight of expectation, and letting the work speak for itself. The movement I had started was bigger than me now. It had spread far beyond my wildest dreams, and it was still growing. But I knew in that moment that I was ready for the next chapter, not because I had to be, but because I wanted to be. And this time, I wasn't just going to lead the movement, I was going to live it. The days following my return to Milan, after the deep reflection and renewed focus on my creative journey, felt different. The air in the studio was lighter, my steps were more deliberate, and the designs I created were not just fabrics, they were pieces of my soul. I wasn't driven by deadlines anymore. I was driven by passion, the same passion that had first sparked my love for fashion years ago. But as the months went by, I realized something else was beginning to stir within me. The deeper I got into the fashion world, the more I noticed the lack of genuine connection. While I was proud of what I had achieved with the global fashion movement, I realized there was a piece missing, a connection beyond the clothes themselves, a connection to the very roots of what fashion should be about: storytelling, human connection, and the ability to give others a voice. As I sat one evening reading through a report from one of our global partners in Africa, I had a thought that struck me like a bolt of lightning. What if fashion could be more than just about wearing clothes? What if it could be an ongoing living dialogue between different cultures, a celebration of identity, history, and the future? And that was when I made the decision. I was going to start a new chapter in my life, not just as a designer, but as a storyteller, someone who would bring fashion to life through experiences, through interactions, and through collaboration. The first step was to create a platform where people could not only wear my designs, but share their stories. A place where the clothes I created would act as a backdrop for their own narratives, where they could express their journey, their culture, their triumphs, and their struggles. I imagined a new kind of runway, one that wasn't about models walking on a stage, but about people of all walks of life: artisans, activists, dreamers, and creators coming together to show what they had to offer the world. So I launched the Narrative Runway, an initiative that would combine fashion shows with personal storytelling. The idea was simple yet powerful. Each collection I created would be paired with a story. These stories would come from the people who wore the pieces, the communities that inspired them, and even the artisans who crafted them. It would be a platform for empowerment, for sharing voices that were often unheard, for making people feel seen and heard in a way that fashion had never done before. I started reaching out to local communities, migrant workers, small-town artisans, people who had faced adversity. Each one of them would become a part of the show, not as models, but as participants in the narrative. They would share their personal stories of struggle and resilience, and through that, they would wear the designs that had been made with their culture in mind. The first show was held in a small warehouse in Milan, not the grand halls of traditional fashion weeks. It wasn't about extravagance or exclusivity, it was about authenticity. We had a small crowd, but the energy in the room was palpable. As each model, or rather each storyteller, walked down the runway, they didn't just showcase clothing, they shared their journey. One woman, an immigrant from Syria named Lilia, walked in a beautifully embroidered dress I had designed with the intricate patterns of her homeland. As she walked, she shared her story of fleeing the war, of finding hope in a new country, and of rebuilding her life. As the room watched her, they didn't just see a model, they saw a survivor. They saw her strength, her courage, and her hope. Another man, a young refugee from Sudan, shared his journey of escaping the violence of his country. He wore a tailored suit inspired by traditional African patterns, a blend of the old and new. As he spoke of his dreams, of his hopes for a better life, he walked with pride, reminding us all of the power of resilience. The stories were moving, and the clothes were not just clothes. They were representations of these individuals' journeys. It wasn't just a fashion show. It was a moment of collective storytelling. That night, as I stood backstage watching the final piece of the collection being worn by a young woman from the Philippines, I realized something. This was the direction I had been seeking. Fashion wasn't just about the clothes. It was about the stories they told, the people they represented, and the way they brought cultures together. The success of the Narrative Runway spread quickly. What had started as a small idea grew into a movement of its own. The media caught wind of what we were doing, and soon designers from all over the world were reaching out to collaborate. They wanted to share their stories too. They wanted their fashion to mean something deeper. As the project gained traction, I started to receive more invitations to speak at conferences, to hold workshops, and to meet with policymakers. The fashion world was listening. The world was listening. And I realized that this wasn't just a business anymore. This was a calling. It wasn't about the glitz and glamour. It wasn't about the fame or the fortune. It was about the impact we were making one story at a time. I had found my true purpose not just as a designer, but as someone who could inspire change and create a bridge between people through the most powerful form of expression storytelling. As I sat back in my Milan apartment that evening looking at the photos from the first show, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The journey had been long and it hadn't always been easy, but I knew that this was exactly where I was meant to be. The future was no longer uncertain. It was clear. I wasn't just designing clothes anymore. I was designing the future of fashion, one that told the stories of the world and connected us all in a way we had never imagined. Months had passed since the success of the narrative runway, and I was more immersed in the movement than ever before. The platform had expanded, and now, instead of just showcasing one collection, we were featuring multiple designers from around the world, each with their own story. The idea had evolved into something bigger than I had ever imagined. Fashion had truly become a global conversation, a conversation about culture, identity, empowerment, and sustainability. But despite the momentum, a new realization was beginning to form within me. As the movement grew, so did the expectations. Everyone was looking to me to lead, to innovate, to continue to push boundaries. And I felt the weight of it. Sometimes the pressure felt like it was consuming me, a constant reminder that this wasn't just about creating clothes, it was about creating a legacy. A legacy I had started with passion, but now I was trying to sustain it with constant action and innovation. One evening, I found myself standing in front of a large window in my Milan apartment, watching the city lights shimmer in the distance. It had been a busy week filled with meetings, press releases, and brainstorming sessions for new initiatives. My mind raced constantly thinking about the next big project. But that night, I felt overwhelmed. I thought back to the early days of my journey when fashion was simple, when I wasn't trying to build an empire, but simply create things I loved. I had started this movement with a vision, one that connected people, told stories, and gave voice to those who had been ignored for too long. But now I was questioning whether I was still aligned with that vision, or if I had gotten lost in the noise of it all. Was I still creating for the right reasons? Was I still being true to myself? The question lingered in my mind as I sat down at my desk, the weight of my thoughts heavy. It was in that moment that I realized what I needed to do next. I needed to pause to reconnect with the essence of what had started this journey in the first place. It wasn't about creating another collection or expanding the movement further. It was about going back to the roots of my creativity. The next morning, I booked a flight. I didn't know exactly where I was going yet, but I knew I needed to get away to find the silence, the inspiration, and the peace I had been missing. I landed in Marrakech, Morocco, a city I had always dreamed of visiting. The vibrant colors of the souks, the scent of spices in the air, the intricate patterns of the architecture, it all felt like a world I had never truly experienced, even though I had been immersed in global fashion for years. Marrakech was raw, authentic, and it reminded me of the beauty in simplicity. I spent days walking through the bustling streets, talking to local artisans, and immersing myself in the culture. The way they spoke about their craft, each item handcrafted with care and tradition, reminded me of the very reason I had started this journey. It wasn't about the trends or the fame. It was about the art, the expression, and the connection to the people who created it. I met a woman named Amina who was a textile artist. She wove intricate designs using traditional Moroccan techniques, and her work was stunning. As we sat together in her studio surrounded by beautiful fabrics and threads, Amina told me her story of how she had learned the craft from her grandmother and how it had become a means of survival for her family. Fashion is not just about clothing, she said. It is a story, a reflection of who we are, and a way for us to honor our roots. Her words struck a chord deep within me. Here I was in a place where fashion had a deeper meaning, where it wasn't just about commerce, but about culture and tradition. I had been so focused on expansion on growth that I had forgotten to honor the roots of what I was doing. I realized that I had to bring that essence back into the movement. Fashion needed to return to its roots where it was a tool for telling stories, for honoring cultures, and for creating meaningful connections. It wasn't just about creating pieces that sold, it was about creating pieces that mattered, that had meaning, that told the stories of the people who made them. After a few weeks in Morocco, I returned to Milan with a newfound sense of purpose. I reconnected with my team, sharing my experiences and the lessons I had learned. It was time to shift the narrative once again. The narrative runway would continue, but it would evolve. We would focus even more on the artisans, the makers, and the stories behind the clothes. We would put the culture, the history, and the traditions of the people at the forefront of everything we did. In the months that followed, I worked alongside artisans from around the world to create a new collection. This time, we showcased not just the clothes, but the people behind them, their stories, their crafts, and their heritage. The collection wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a cultural celebration. And as we unveiled the pieces at a global fashion week, it was clear that this new direction had reignited the movement in a way I hadn't expected. I stood backstage watching as the models walked down the runway wearing designs inspired by the stories of the artisans I had met along the way. Each piece had a history, a meaning, a purpose. And in that moment, I knew that this was the future of fashion. It wasn't just about selling clothes. It was about honoring the traditions, telling the stories, and creating a space where cultures could connect and be celebrated. This was the next chapter. And it wasn't about creating a legacy through fame or fortune. It was about creating a legacy of connection, of meaning, and of purpose. Months had passed since the launch of the Narrative Runway initiative, and the movement had continued to grow in ways I never thought possible. What began as a small idea in a Milan studio had transformed into a global community of creators, artisans, and dreamers who were all bound by one common purpose: to use fashion as a platform for empowerment and change. It was incredible to see how far we had come. The project had reached new heights with designers from marginalized communities across the world now being given a chance to showcase their work on global platforms. The movement had evolved from being an annual show into a year-round dialogue about culture identity and the true power of fashion. But there was something I realized as the success continued to mount, something I hadn't fully acknowledged until now. It wasn't the clothes that mattered. It wasn't the glitz of the runway, or the applause at the end of the show. What truly mattered, what truly made this movement powerful, was the community that had been built around it. I sat one evening in my Milan apartment scrolling through social media and reading the posts from designers, artisans, and even customers who had been touched by the movement. Their stories were flooding in. One woman shared how she had turned her small craft business into a thriving enterprise after participating in the Narrative Runway. Another designer spoke about how she had found her voice after years of being ignored by mainstream fashion. Even a customer shared how purchasing a piece from the collection made her feel seen and heard, how she was wearing more than just fabric, but a story, a movement. It became clear to me that the Narrative Runway wasn't just a fashion show, it was a living, breathing entity. It was a community of people who were connected by a shared vision of empowerment, culture, and authenticity. It was about amplifying voices that had been silenced for too long and making sure that those who had been overlooked now had a seat at the table. I decided to travel to some of the countries where the movement had been making an impact. I visited artisan workshops in India, met with young designers in Kenya, and toured sustainable fashion initiatives in South America. What I found in every place was the same thing: people who had been given the tools and opportunities to create and thrive. In India, I watched as women from rural communities wove intricate textiles, turning their craft into a profitable business that not only provided them with income, but also gave them a sense of pride and ownership. In Kenya, I sat with young designers who were now able to export their creations globally. In South America, I saw how the fusion of indigenous and modern techniques was creating a new kind of fashion that celebrated both heritage and innovation. Each community was doing something unique, but they all shared one thing in common: they were empowered. And it was fashion that had given them that power. As I spent more time in these communities, I started to realize that this movement was never just about me. It was never about my vision alone. It was about all of us. It was about people coming together to build something bigger than any one person could create. It was about recognizing that true power lies not in individual achievement, but in collective effort. One day, I received an invitation to speak at an international conference on sustainable fashion in New York. As I prepared for the speech, I thought about everything that had brought me here: the challenges, the setbacks, the triumphs, and the failures. But most of all, I thought about the community we had built together. It wasn't just about the clothes. It wasn't about the global platforms or the accolades. It was about the people, the artisans, the creators, the customers, and the supporters who believed in what we were doing. When the day of the conference came, I stood on stage looking out at the sea of faces, many of them strangers to me. But as I began to speak, I realized that they weren't strangers at all. They were part of this movement, part of this community that had grown into something beautiful. As I shared our story, the story of how fashion had been used to empower and connect people, I could feel the energy in the room. I wasn't just talking about clothes. I was talking about people. I was talking about real change. The speech was well received, but more than the applause or the praise, what stayed with me was the conversation that followed. Afterward, people came up to me to share their own stories of empowerment, of how they had been touched by the movement. Designers, activists, and even customers approached me expressing how the narrative runway had inspired them to take their own steps toward creating positive change in their communities. It hit me then. This wasn't just about me or my brand. This was about all of us coming together and sharing a collective vision for a better, more inclusive world. In the weeks that followed, I continued to travel to speak, to create, and to collaborate. But the more I engaged with the global community that had sprung from the narrative runway, the more I understood the true power of what we had built. It wasn't about dominating the fashion world or competing with others. It was about sharing stories, connecting cultures, and fostering an environment where people could rise together. And as the movement continued to grow, I realized that this was only the beginning. The future was wide open, filled with possibilities. The ripple effect I had started had become a wave of change that was only growing stronger. I had never felt more connected, more alive, and more aligned with my purpose. The world was waiting, and we were ready to make our mark. The weeks following the success of the narrative runway and the growth of the global movement had brought a new level of awareness to the fashion industry. People were beginning to see the true power of fashion, not just as a product, but as a tool for storytelling, for empowerment, and for building meaningful connections. Yet as I stood in the middle of it all, I realized that our journey wasn't just about creating another popular trend or another business model. It was about something much bigger. It was about legacy. I had always been focused on change, on pushing the boundaries of fashion, and on doing something that mattered. But the deeper I got into the movement, the more I began to understand that change doesn't just happen with one collection or one show. Change happens when it becomes part of a culture, when it's embedded in the way we think, the way we live, and the way we treat each other. As the narrative around fashion continued to shift, I found myself contemplating the future of the movement. I had built something beautiful, something powerful. But I realized that this was never about me. The real change was in the stories we were telling, the stories of artisans, of creators, of communities, and of people who had once been invisible. These were the true heroes of the movement. I had already seen how the initiative had begun to influence others. Other designers, brands, and fashion houses were reaching out wanting to collaborate, wanting to create collections with a purpose. Even outside the fashion industry, the movement was sparking conversations about ethics, sustainability, and the importance of telling the truth. But the question I kept asking myself was, what happens next? What happens when we've created a movement that's been acknowledged and celebrated globally? Where do we go from here? One evening, I took a step back and reflected on my path. The years of struggle, the betrayals, the mistakes, all of it had led me to this point. And as I thought about the work we had done together, I realized that our next step had to be a focus on sustainability, not just in the materials we used, but in the people and communities we supported. It was time to go deeper to give even more of a platform to those who had been overlooked for so long. It was time to ensure that the communities we worked with were not just empowered, but were sustained long-term. I began to outline new initiatives programs that would go beyond simply showcasing fashion. We would focus on education, skill building, and long-term economic development in the areas where we worked. We would collaborate with nonprofits and organizations to ensure that the work we were doing had a lasting impact. It wasn't just about creating collections. It was about creating a legacy that would outlast any one collection, any one fashion week. It was time to build a foundation for the future, a future where fashion wasn't just a fleeting moment in the spotlight, but a lasting movement that empowered generations to come. As the months passed, I began to see the fruits of these new initiatives. We launched education programs for young designers in underserved communities. We created microloan opportunities for artisans to expand their businesses, and we began to establish long-term partnerships with organizations that were dedicated to making fashion more sustainable. I saw firsthand the difference we were making in people's lives. I saw the pride in the artisans' eyes as they were able to scale their businesses and pass down their skills to the next generation. I saw the joy in the young designers who now had the opportunity to showcase their work to a global audience. And I saw the hope in the eyes of those who had once been forgotten, now empowered to pursue their dreams and build something for themselves. As I stood on stage at a global conference on sustainability and fashion, I looked out at the crowd. This wasn't just a speech about fashion, it was about the legacy of change we had created together. It was about the people who had made this possible, the communities that had transformed along the way, and the future we were building together. The applause was deafening, but it wasn't the applause that mattered. What mattered was the realization that this was only the beginning. We had started something that was bigger than any one person, bigger than any one brand. We had started a movement that was reshaping the world of fashion and the world itself. And as I stepped off the stage that night, I knew that I had found my true purpose. It wasn't about being the most famous designer or having the biggest runway show. It was about creating a legacy of empowerment, of storytelling, and of making fashion a platform for change. This was more than just a career. This was a mission. And I was ready to keep pushing, to keep creating, and to keep building. As the movement continued to grow and evolve, I found myself in a position I never anticipated. What had started as a small idea, one person's vision for fashion as a tool for social good, had transformed into something far bigger than I could have ever imagined. The narrative runway was no longer just a platform for fashion. It had become a global movement for change. I had received countless messages from designers, creators, and even customers who shared their stories of how the movement had impacted their lives. What began as a way to give artisans a voice in the fashion world had sparked a larger conversation about social justice, sustainability, and the power of community. It wasn't just about the clothes anymore. The narrative runway had become a space for empowerment, a platform for people from all walks of life to come together to share their stories and to make a difference. It was no longer about selling clothes. It was about creating a ripple effect that was changing lives around the world. One day, I received a call that would change everything once again. It was from a nonprofit organization in the Middle East, working with women in war-torn regions. They had heard about the narrative runway and wanted to collaborate to help empower women who had been displaced by conflict. These women, they explained, had lost everything but still carried with them a wealth of knowledge, creativity, and resilience. They asked if I would be willing to help provide them with the resources and platform to share their stories through fashion. I didn't hesitate for a moment. I knew this was the next step, the next chapter in the story we were building. The movement had always been about amplifying voices that had been silenced for too long, and these women's voices needed to be heard. I immediately flew to the region where I met with the women who had been waiting for this opportunity. Their stories were heartbreaking stories of war loss and displacement, but even in the face of unimaginable hardship, they had not lost their strength or their creativity. They were ready to tell their stories through the clothes they made, and they wanted to show the world that they were still here, still standing, still fighting. We worked together to design a collection that would be showcased at a global fashion event, but this collection was different. It wasn't just about the fashion, it was about what it represented. Each piece was a testament to the resilience of these women, to their strength in the face of adversity. It was about giving them a platform to speak for themselves, to reclaim their identities, and to show the world that even in the most difficult circumstances, creativity and hope could still thrive. When the collection was unveiled at the event, the world watched as these women who had once been invisible took the runway with pride. As they walked, they shared their stories. The room was filled with emotion as people from all corners of the world saw firsthand the power of fashion to tell a story and to change lives. The impact of that collaboration was profound. It wasn't just about raising awareness, it was about making a tangible difference. The women involved in the project were able to start their own businesses creating sustainable fashion that reflected their culture and heritage. They became leaders in their communities, using their newfound platforms to inspire others to share their stories and fight for their rights. I stood backstage that night watching as the women who had once been displaced by war now walked confidently in front of an international audience. It was one of the most powerful moments of my career. It was a reminder of why I had started this journey in the first place, not to build a brand, but to create something that would empower others. The success of that collaboration sparked a new wave of interest in the movement. People began to see fashion in a new light, not just as something to be worn, but as something that could create real change. It was no longer about consumption. It was about creation. It was about collaboration. It was about community. As I sat in my office one evening reflecting on everything we had accomplished, I realized that we had created something far bigger than any one collection, any one show, or any one fashion house. We had created a movement that was changing the way people saw the world. And we were just getting started. The future was bright. The possibilities were endless. We had only scratched the surface of what was possible, and I was more determined than ever to continue the work. There was still so much to do. There were still so many voices to amplify, so many communities to empower, and so many stories to be told. As I looked out the window of my studio, I knew that this was only the beginning. The movement would continue to grow, and together, we would create a future where fashion was not just about what we wear, but about the change we wanted to see in the world. It had been another year since the global collaborations, and the movement I had started was now a worldwide phenomenon. What had once been an idea in a Milan studio had transformed into something far greater than I could have ever dreamed. People from all walks of life from different parts of the world were coming together under a common cause. Fashion was no longer just about style, it was about purpose. It was about humanity. It was about making real, lasting change. I had traveled to multiple countries, seeing firsthand how the impact of our work had spread far beyond what I ever imagined. In India, women who had once been confined to their homes now ran their own fashion businesses. In South America, young designers were gaining the recognition they deserved, their work showcased on international stages. In Africa, artisans were creating pieces that told the story of their culture, their struggles, and their triumphs. But the journey hadn't been without its obstacles. The more successful the movement became, the more complex the issues grew. The pressure to maintain momentum, to stay relevant, to keep the stories flowing, it was intense. There were days when I felt overwhelmed, when I wondered if I was still on the right path. Was I still connected to the original purpose? Or had I gotten lost in the scale of it all? One night, while I was at my desk in Milan reviewing the progress reports and emails from partners around the world, I realized something. I had been so focused on expanding the movement that I hadn't taken the time to just pause and reflect. I needed to go back to the roots. The next day, I decided to take a trip not to another fashion capital or to meet with more collaborators, but to a small village in Morocco. I wanted to return to a place where the spirit of the movement had first been ignited, the spirit of true connection, authenticity, and community. Arriving in Morocco was like stepping back in time, but it was also stepping into the future. The streets were alive with color, sound, and culture. The souks were filled with artisans whose work told stories, whose creations were a testament to the craftsmanship passed down through generations. I wandered through the winding streets of Marrakesh, soaking in the sights, the smells, the textures. It was here, in this vibrant, bustling city, that I remembered what it was all about. The energy, the creativity, the humanity. It was all here. I sat down with a group of artisans, men and women who had been creating beautiful textiles for generations. They told me about their work, their struggles, and their dreams. One woman named Yasmina shared her story of how she had learned the art of weaving from her mother. For years, we were just creating for survival, she said. But now, with your help, we're creating for our future. Fashion has given us a voice, a place in the world. Her words echoed in my mind. Fashion had given them a voice, a platform to tell their stories. It was the same thing I had been trying to do all along: use fashion to elevate people, to connect cultures, to make them feel seen and heard. The trip to Morocco was more than just a break from the grind of the fashion industry. It was a reminder of why I started this movement in the first place. I hadn't started it to build a global empire. I hadn't started it to create fame or recognition. I had started it to make a difference, to amplify voices, to build bridges between communities. When I returned to Milan, I knew what I had to do. It was time to shift the focus back to where it all began. It wasn't about growing the movement for the sake of growing it. It was about staying true to the mission, connecting people, telling stories, and making fashion a force for positive change. I gathered my team and we began to restructure. We would focus more on the stories behind the designs, on the artisans and the communities we worked with. We would create a deeper connection between the fashion and the people who made it. And most importantly, we would ensure that every collaboration, every collection was a testament to the authenticity and humanity that had always been at the heart of the movement. Months later, as we launched a new collection at an intimate, community-driven event, I felt a deep sense of pride. The collection was not just about the clothes, it was about the people behind them, the stories they had shared, the cultures they had represented. And as the pieces walked down the runway, I knew that we were on the right path. The movement had started as a ripple, a small wave that was barely noticed. But now it had become a tidal wave, a force of change that was reshaping the fashion industry and beyond. The journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. As I walked through the streets of Milan that evening, the city lights glowing softly against the dusk, I couldn't help but feel that I was on the edge of something monumental. It had been a year since I had returned from Morocco, and the changes I had implemented were starting to take hold in ways I hadn't anticipated. The narrative runway had expanded beyond fashion. It had become a movement, a shift in the way people saw themselves and their communities through the lens of fashion and storytelling. But it wasn't just about the clothes anymore. It was about people. It was about transformation. It was about weaving together the stories of cultures, struggles, and triumphs into something more than just a collection. It was a tapestry of the human experience. The focus of our movement had evolved over the past year, and I had seen firsthand the impact it was making. We had empowered artisans from remote villages given voice to marginalized designers and created a platform where people from different walks of life could share their stories with the world. The global audience was hungry for more than just trends. They were hungry for meaning, for authenticity, for connection. And yet, as proud as I was of the progress we had made, there was still a part of me that wondered if we could do even more. Could we create a space where the next generation of designers didn't just have the opportunity to showcase their work, but could truly change the way we think about fashion culture and global connection? The answer came in the form of a partnership that would take us to new heights. I had been approached by a group of influential leaders in the sustainability and ethical fashion space. They had been following our progress and were eager to collaborate on an initiative that would bring the narrative runway into new territories: education, sustainability, and ethical business practices. The idea was simple, yet powerful, to create a global year-long program for young designers from marginalized backgrounds to receive mentorship training and the resources to launch their own ethical fashion brands. The focus wasn't just about creating beautiful designs. It was about creating businesses with integrity, businesses that would uplift their communities and honor the cultures they represented. It was about building a foundation for the future, one where the next generation of designers wouldn't just be creating for fashion's sake, but for a purpose far greater than themselves. I immediately agreed to the partnership. It felt like the logical next step. We had empowered artisans, shared stories, and connected cultures, but now it was time to put education and sustainability at the forefront. It was time to show that fashion could be a true force for change, not just in how we look, but in how we live. The program was launched with great enthusiasm, and the response was overwhelming. Young designers from all over the world, Africa, Asia, South America, Europe, applied for the opportunity to be part of the first cohort. The diversity of the applicants was staggering, and each one brought something unique to the table: stories of resilience, of struggle, and of vision. Over the course of the year, we mentored and guided the selected designers, giving them the tools to not only create, but to think critically about their impact. We taught them how to source materials ethically, how to build sustainable supply chains, and how to run businesses that put people and the planet first. But more than that, we taught them that they were part of a legacy, a movement that had the power to reshape the future. When the time came for them to showcase their collections, the event was unlike anything we had done before. It wasn't just about models walking down a runway. It was about sharing the journeys of the designers themselves, the communities that had shaped their work, and the mission behind their creations. Each designer stood before an audience that was no longer just there to admire the clothes, but to understand the story behind them. I was moved beyond words as I watched each designer share their collection. It was clear that these weren't just clothes, they were expressions of a new era. An era where fashion was no longer about fast consumption and fleeting trends. It was about lasting impact, about giving back, about creating a future where fashion could be part of the solution, not the problem. As the show concluded, the applause wasn't just for the designs, it was for the change that was unfolding right before our eyes. I stood backstage overwhelmed with emotion, knowing that this was the beginning of something even bigger than what we had already accomplished. This was the full circle. We had started with a simple idea: to empower through fashion, to tell stories, and to connect people. But now we were creating a legacy of designers, of communities, and of a world where fashion didn't just represent who we were, it represented the world we wanted to build. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. And as I looked at the bright, eager faces of the designers who had been a part of this first cohort, I knew that we were building something that would last long after I was gone. We were shaping the future of fashion, and that future was one of purpose, community, and lasting change.